A total economic embargo has been imposed on Venezuela. President Trump signed the executive order Monday, freezing all of their government assets in the U.S. The order also allows the U.S. to sanction anyone who is involved with the Maduro administration.
It's in response to what the President Trump calls, quote, the continued usurpation of power by the illegitimate Nicolas Maduro regime. Strong words. The executive order does not allow the continued supply of humanitarian assistance, it does allow, but there are concerns that the aid could stop. Here to discuss the embargo's implications and what could happen next is communications strategist and former Foreign Service officer Lindsay Singleton. Welcome, Lindsay.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Lindsay, tell us about what these sanctions actually mean. Is it a total embargo, like the Cuban embargo that we currently have against that island nation, or is it a little bit more complicated?
Well, it is a little bit more complicated. So for the U.S. government, there's no actual definition of embargo the way that we think about it. So if you ask someone from Treasury, they will tell you that they don't actually call what we know as the Cuba embargo an embargo. They call it the Cuba sanctions program. So what Treasury does is enact targeted sanctions against countries, individuals, financial assets, etc. So in that sense, it's not actually an embargo the way that we think about it. And then if you read the executive order, it's actually quite targeted against Venezuelan assets here under U.S. jurisdiction. So looking at that and looking at the timing of the executive order, it appears that this is likely very targeted against Citgo and protecting Citgo from any claims against it in court. So on July 29th, there was an upholding of a claim in court against Citgo on behalf of a Canadian mining company. But what this order does is protect Citgo from any actions against it, which is likely supportive of the Guaido government to try to help ensure that that government is able to maintain some control over that asset over the long term.
Let's talk about the human beings who are there, reporting that things are so bad, conditions are so bad that the butchers aren't even selling meat anymore. Entrails are basically the best that you can get because people just don't have the money to buy actual meat from animals. People are starving. The hospitals have no medicine. What is the situation on the ground for the people of Venezuela, and how will this impact them?
So in Venezuela right now on the ground, it is a complete humanitarian disaster. I mean, there have been rolling shortages for about 20 years now. Under Maduro, this has only gotten worse. You have very limited access to food, and on average, people are losing about 19 pounds a year under what they call the Maduro diet, just because of lack of food. Medicine is also, as you mentioned, a huge issue. Cases of malaria, yellow fever, all sorts of diseases that, for the most part, have been eradicated are popping up, and children and the most vulnerable, sick, elderly, they're dying. In terms of the impact that the new sanctions will have on them, it's unclear. Being able to make exceptions for humanitarian aid is typically a part of such sanctions, but in practice they're very hard to uphold. It's already, though, very hard to get food and medicine into the country, so I'm not sure that the new sanctions will have much of an increased impact in that regard.
One thing I wonder about here is, I mean, the Trump administration made a big gamble here, backing Guaido's essentially. I mean, they're backing a competitor to the current government. I mean, whatever you think about legitimacy, whoever is a government is who has a monopoly on the use of force continues to be Maduro, at least for now. I mean, this is not going very well. Ultimately, these sanctions and all of this, as long as they control the military and the police force, they're probably going to remain in power, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing here is something similar to what happened in Syria. So in Syria, you've had a continued collapse. You have continued military control, basically, from the Assad regime. And it's very similar to what we're seeing in Venezuela. And just as happened with Syria, you've sort of gotten, to a bit of a exhaustion in the media and in the public about attention to the story.
Yeah.
And that's happening in Venezuela too. And it is a tragedy. And it strikes me that some of the things that are happening with the government, with our U.S. government, as well as the Guaido regime, their participation in these peace talks with the Maduro regime, that these are ploys to keep the story in the news to try to force some sort of action or pressure against Maduro.
I think, yeah, that's a very good comparison to Syria, because the lesson Maduro has to take away from this is, as long as the Russian cash is still there, as long as the Cuban cash is still there, and they have the guns, they can probably outlast this.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and what is the response by the Venezuelan people to the U.S.'s involvement in the future of their nation?
I think that in the opposition circles, they very much want the U.S. to intervene in some way. I think even militarily. You also see a lot of support from this from the more hawkish Hispanic voters in Miami and Florida in general. There has always been, though, in Latin America, a very strong feeling against U.S. military intervention.
For good reason.
For good reason. Historically, it's not gone so well, and there's a lot of sensitivity. There's a lot of sensitivity for that with our international partners as well. So you're going to see a mix of interest in that, probably with varying levels of what they might want the U.S. to do.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me again of Syria. I remember these opposition guys, 2013, begging the United States to get involved. But I mean, yeah, it serves their interests, but it's not, like, we have to have major discussions about what exactly that means. I guess the real question here is where do we actually go from here? The Guaido government in particular seems quite precarious now. They have no peace talks. Yeah, they might be legitimately recognized by the United States, but what are they going to be in a year from now if Maduro is still around? What's going to happen?
It's a great question. I think it's something that all folks who are watching Venezuela are asking themselves, because there's no clear exit strategy for Maduro, and he is holding on. He has no reason to step down. If Guaido can find ways to help feed the people of Venezuela, that's one thing, but so far that strategy has been out of reach.
And Lindsay, why is the Trump administration so intensely interested in Venezuela? Yes, the humanitarian situation is horrifying, but frankly, there are a lot of places in the world that have terrible humanitarian situations where the Trump administration has not focused this kind of time and attention.
I think look no further than the Florida vote.
Interesting. So actually, yeah, I mean, that's the final thing. Why is it such an animating thing amongst Americans in Florida?
Well, you have a large Cuban population in Florida, which has lived a similar situation and left Cuba for similar reasons. With the influx of Venezuelan emigres to Florida, now you also additionally have their vote and their voice on the issue. They are a very vocal community and a swing state.
Yeah, very
Really
interesting.
Lindsay, thank you so much. Keep us updated,
Thank
please.
you. Thanks
Appreciate
for having
that.
me.
Next up on Rising, the largest minority group in the 2020 electorate is Hispanics. We were just mentioning a little bit of that.
Their influence could shape the election's outcome. Hill reporter Rafael Bernal, he describes the efforts of Republicans and Democrats to woo the very important voting bloc when Rising continues.